Good evening and welcome to Imperial Lates Online, our virtual explorations of science at Imperial College London. I'm your host this evening. My name is Beth Rainiers. I'm a PhD researcher at Imperial College London, and my research looks into how climate change is impacting and influencing English and Welsh wine production. This latest Lates Online week is the last before the series takes a break over the summer. This week, we are celebrating the wonders of the natural kingdom, with scientists and conservationists working to understand and protect wildlife in the UK and around the world. Later in the week, we have a debate on rewilding, a garden animal drawing class, an insect-inspired yoga session, and an animal pub quiz co-hosted with our resident expert on African wild dogs. All that is to come. However, tonight, we are going to be giving some love to a collection of creatures who we might dismiss, take for granted, or don't quite appreciate how wonderful and important they are. All forms of nature are really important, and these creatures, whilst they may not seem the cutest or cuddliest to you, perform important roles across the animal kingdom. Understanding animals and biodiversity is a hot topic, now more than ever, as these animals we are about to talk about today are at risk from human activities. This year is a very important year for biodiversity and the wider environment, as the International Conference of Parties, known as COP26, is happening in Glasgow this year. Today we bring you the Unloved Animal Club's first meeting. This evening we have 5 experts on amphibians, ants, bees, snakes and vultures, who will share their passion for their animal of choice in a series of 5-minute lightning presentations. After we hear our guest presentations, we'll bring them all on screen to take your questions as part of the panel discussion. So to all of you watching live at home, please post any questions you have on toads, ants, bees, snakes and vultures in the YouTube chat below, and we will put them to our resident experts later in the night. And finally, if that wasn't enough excitement from Monday night, to close tonight's proceedings, we have a special guest, Imperial's own climate change scientist and poet, Robin Lamboll, who has created a special poem just for us that features all 5 of our unloved animals. In terms of housekeeping, this event is being recorded. If you're commenting on YouTube, please keep things polite and respectful. Post your comments as we go on the YouTube chat below, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. We are live and broadcasting from various, hopefully, quiet corners, but please bear with us if anything doesn't go quite as planned. We all know now what it's like if you forget to press the unmute button. And throughout and after the event, please also tag us on social media using hashtag Imperial Lates. So if that's understood by everyone, let's open proceedings with our first speaker. Up first, we have Holly. Holly is a PhD researcher at Imperial College London. Her research focuses on how best to recover degraded tropical rainforest logging estates. She is currently looking at how long it takes for vegetation biomass to regenerate after logging cycles in Malaysia and Borneo. Over to you, Holly.
Hi, thanks for that, Beth. If you walk along the forest paths of Central America, you will come across vibrant green acacia trees which seem to have carved out a space in this bustling ecosystem all to themselves. They're unbothered by other plants, very hungry caterpillars, or any other herbivore for that matter. At first glance, it makes complete sense that cows and other mammals will avoid the plants because of the huge thorns that give the bullhorn acacia their names. But that doesn't explain why hungry leaf-munching or nectar-seeking insects won't drop by for a snack, or why these trees seem to stand alone. Can we have the next slide, please? The answer is because these trees have their tiny bodyguards, acacia ants, or Pseudomyrmex ferruginea, which work in exchange for food and lodging. The acacia have green glands at the leaf's base which produce nectar for their tenants, and these little orange blobs called Beltian bodies, which are a source of fats and proteins for the ant larva. The acacias also produce additional nectaries solely for use by the ants, which gives them a bonus rush of sugar. As a thanks for these treats, the ants themselves act as tiny gardeners, removing nearby vines which are at risk of choking the acacia or competing for sunlight. They will also fight any other living creature that comes within range. Emerging research even shows that the ants can protect their host plants from infection and disease. Next slide. Let me be clear. These ants make very effective bouncers. The moment you touch the plant, the ants will swarm all over your hand. They can even smell you coming. They bite you with their pincers, gripping on tight, and then stab you with a stinger in their abdomen, repeatedly. And their bite is so strong, they're very hard to remove. With one of the top 10 most painful insect stings in the world, I can imagine that any animal brave enough to try and eat these acacias in spite of the thorns will not come back for a second helping once they've encountered the ants. That is, any animal except a scientist. I have to confess that studying these ants was not my first choice of project. I was in the Chickable Forest of Belize, home to so much incredible biodiversity. I wanted to be doing a project on carbon stock assessments or something really cool like tarantulas, not ants. I had enough of these in my garden at home. But as the pain of the first 100 or so stings was wearing off, aided by a bottle of the local rum, I started to appreciate just what I was working with here. Every young acacia ant queen wants a palace of her own. She flies through the forest looking for an acacia with an unoccupied thorn. If she finds one, she'll chew a hole into one of these hollow thorns and tear off her own wings so she can fit inside and lay her eggs. She only gets one shot at picking her new home. If something happens to that tree, she can't fly to a new one. But if she gets it right, then in just 3 years, she can create a colony of 16,000 workers ready to protect their bullhorn acacia. The acacia themselves are vital to the health of the ecosystem. Their long roots help stabilise the soil. Acacia are legumes, which means they fix atmospheric nitrogen and improve soil quality, enhancing the growth of neighbouring plants as well as themselves. Acacia abundance in plant communities affects nitrogen cycling at the ecosystem level, as well as in the immediate vicinity. This newly fixed nitrogen fuels much of tropical net primary productivity, which aids forest succession and recovery after disturbance. As a pioneer species, they're often found colonising roadsides and hiking trails, or in areas that are regenerating after disturbance. In addition to protecting these important plants, acacia ants have been used in traditional Mayan medicine to treat a variety of illnesses, including asthma and depression. This example of obligate mutualism between bullhorn acacia and the acacia ants is one of the most well-known examples in the tropics, but the system isn't perfect. Sometimes you'll come across an acacia tree which looks a little worse for wear. It might be overshadowed by a neighbouring plant, have cobwebs between its branches, or show evidence of herbivory. These plants are the victims of a scam. Pseudomyrmex gracilis is an ant which appears very similar to Pseudomyrmex ferruginea, only slightly darker in colour, but it's terribly lazy in comparison to its fiery cousin. The trees with these con artists are generally smaller, skinnier, and lack in sunlight. There's one in the tube here, as you can see, along with a spider that we found on the same plant in Belize. Trees that don't receive protection from their ants are often stripped of their growing shoot tips and therefore suffer stunted growth, which means they don't get as much sunlight and they don't do so well. Sick acacia trees are found with these parasitic ants inside, but it's not yet clear whether this is a symptom or a cause. What we do know is that with all the threats that tropical forests are facing, acacia trees and their bodyguard ants are important for the maintenance of regulating ecosystem services. And for that reason, the fearsome little acacia ant Pseudomyrmex ferruginea is well worthy of our love and appreciation, even if they make for really nasty neighbours.
Thank you very much, Holly. I feel a little bit scared of the ants now, if I'm honest, but maybe they do deserve some love. Amazing. Okay, up next we have John. John has a PhD in amphibian population biology and extinction risk from Imperial College London, which is the culmination of a lifelong interest in watched reptiles and amphibians doing very little. He has worked in conservation and ecology for nearly 20 years, which has included stints at the Zoological Society of London and Chester Zoo. He's now trying to convince primatologists and companion animal enthusiasts at Liverpool John Moores University to mend their ways and get into scales and slime instead. Over to you, John.
So, thanks very much, and thanks for the invite to speak today. So my first picture is from at school. We could do a project where we drew anything in this and it got put onto a plate. Here's my plate. I've still got the original. I could have drawn a rocket, a train, a unicorn, and I drew a toad on a lily. But I didn't just draw a toad on a lily pad, as you can see in the picture. There's also something about the life history, the life cycle of this animal, the froglet and the adult. And that's something that for me is magical. It's the first reason to love toads. Quite aside from somebody from Yorkshire says the word toad, is that this life cycle is something that all kids know about and all kids love. So next slide, please, producer. This is a picture from the Natural History Photographer the few years ago. This is where baby toads come from. Okay, so a few weeks ago, I was out in the evenings looking at this. Male toads calling, females coming in. You get the eggs laid, tadpoles, they start to emerge, legs, back legs, front legs. Then you get tiny adults in about June, July time through to adults. Kids up and down the country fascinated by this. Jam jars, fish tanks, garden ponds. You'll see kids transfixed by this. You see it on social media, you see it on Twitter. It's such a fascinating story. It's something that I think for kids, something like the common toad, the common frog here in the UK, it's something that kids have at birth. And my job as a parent, as an educator, as a lecturer, is basically to allow that to grow. Don't stifle it, because it's there. So the common toad is a really nice example of how kids have an immediate buy into nature, real interest in that. It's just about fostering that love. Next, please, producer. So this is where the spawn comes from. This is a picture I took a couple of weeks ago. This is a common toad breeding ball. Okay. Now I picked them up because this is lots of male toads trying to breed with a female. Unfortunately, the reason I picked it up in this case, the female in question was not a toad. It was a common frog, a mistaken identity. They're so keen to produce eggs, to fertilize eggs, they grab onto anything. The other reason you can pick them up, if you tried to do this with something like common frogs, they'd be all over the place, jumping around. Toads are laid back. The temp's really calm. Okay, you pick them up and they're like, what are you doing? Just let me go, put me down. And the reason for that, one of the things about toads is they have warty skin. They produce lots of chemicals, lots of substances in their skin for lots of different reasons. In this case, it's anti-predator behavior. Okay, so they taste bad. That's where they really relax, because they know that they taste bad. Okay, many things eat them, or at least eat the top of the bodies and the skin. Now, what about it? Why is that useful? Why should we love them for this? Well, from a purely selfish point of view, it's really useful for things like the pharmaceutical trade. So substances have been used to treat things like depression and heart conditions. So from a selfish point of view, they're really good for looking after human health. They're also really useful indicators of the ecosystem. Next slide, please, producer. This is a sad picture. These are dead amphibians. They died of an amphibian infectious disease. I spent a lot of the last 15 years of my life studying this. This is from one site. Okay, populations have declined, species are extinct as a result of this, including the common toad. Okay, so they're a really good bioindicator of what's happening in the environment. Diseases are really highly visual. You see it happening. Things like climate change, urbanization, and land use are not visible. We see the work over much longer time spans. So we need to look at amphibians as a really good bioindicator of what we're doing to them. Let's look after them, let's be aware of them, and let's heed their warnings. Next slide, please, producer. That was a depressing one. So this is a nice one to finish on. This is my daughter, Freya. Freya's a live weight. She spent 15 minutes not moving, staring at some toad spawn in our garden pond. Moving at all. Again, it brings us back to this sort of, I think, intrinsic interest that kids have in amphibians. Okay? It's about our relationship with nature. It's really important right now. Now is a tipping point for how we treat nature, and they need to look after it. For kids, for the future. Interest is there. Let's foster it as well as we can. They're a good start, but I'd say a really nice way to start as a gateway animal into the natural world is something like the humble, lumpy common toad. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, John. I think we can all kind of remember, even now, kind of standing over ponds and looking at frogs. I feel like I still have that childhood fascination with amphibians and toads. So brilliant. Thank you so much. Up next, we have Niall. And so Niall currently works for Natural England, advising on the land ecology aspects of nationally significant infrastructure projects. His research interests involve cross-disciplinary research using ecological, economic and social perspectives, with his most recent work examining human attitudes towards scavengers in South Africa, specifically hyenas, jackals, and vultures.
Hi, thanks for that, Beth. Good evening. My name is Niall. A common theme in my research has been exploring how humans perceive animals and what drives positive and negative attitudes towards them. I spent several years in South Africa studying scavengers and the perceptions that different groups of people have towards these often misunderstood animals. My unloved animal today is the white-backed vulture, but I will also talk about vultures more broadly, as many of the issues and threats faced are not restricted to a single species. The white-backed vulture, which ranges through sub-Saharan Africa, is critically endangered, with the population declining by approximately 90% over the last century, and current estimates suggest that there are less than 30,000 mature individuals remaining. Such steep declines are exacerbated by poor attitudes towards vultures. People tend to view them as ugly, unclean, and they associate vultures with death and disease, when in fact the very opposite is true. Consequently, they are undervalued, understudied, and unloved. We should care about vultures for a number of reasons, and not least because they're majestic birds that beautifully illustrate the cyclical nature of life on Earth. The most conspicuous service that vultures provide humans is regulating disease by recycling dead animals. By doing this, they outcompete potentially harmful bacteria or generalist species such as rats and feral dogs, who are vectors for a litany of harmful diseases. In the early 2000s, India's vultures almost became extinct, with devastating results. The veterinary drug diclofenac had gained popular use among livestock farmers, who traditionally disposed of deceased livestock by leaving them out for vultures. However, diclofenac is lethal to vultures. This caused a shocking decline in the population, and as a consequence, outbreaks of anthrax, rabies, and bubonic plague became significantly more prevalent in the human population. Now, research has estimated the economic impact of the vulture decline in India cost the government £1.3 billion per year. Vultures also provide important cultural services. They feature in books, films, and folklore, and many tourists travel to see them, even if they aren't necessarily at the top of the sightings list. Vultures also have important religious and spiritual significance for many indigenous people, but in some cases this has been a double-edged sword. In southern Africa, vultures, including the white-backed vulture, are harvested for traditional medicine. The most common usage is to consume the brain, typically by smoking, which is believed to imbue the user with the power of foresight, allowing them to see into the future. With ever-increasing urban populations, demand far outstrips the ability to harvest sustainably, especially in combination with other pressures. Because the trade in vultures is illegal, it's a very difficult subject to study, and there is no mechanism for regulation. The traditional medicine market is estimated to be worth £145 million per year in South Africa alone, and the demand for these products has been steadily increasing despite progressively stricter enforcement efforts. Another major threat for vultures is poisoning. Across Africa and Asia, vultures are routinely unintentionally poisoned by farmers who are attempting to lethally control livestock predators, or they are intentionally poisoned by poachers who do not want circling vultures to lead authorities to carcasses before they have had time to make a getaway. These events can be catastrophic. As an example, in 2019, an incident of poachers poisoning an elephant carcass led to the death of 537 vultures, including 468 white-backed vultures. That equates to about 1.5% of the population in a single event. These are just a few of the myriad of threats, which also include collision with energy infrastructure, habitat destruction, and increasingly climate change. This puts many vulture species in a very tenuous position, which could have real-world impacts on societies which rely on the crucial ecosystem services that they provide. Urgent action is needed to halt the decline, both in Africa and globally. Joined-up thinking between governments across continents is important because these species are known to be highly mobile and they don't observe traditional borders. Therefore, interventions need to be across whole ranges rather than just individual countries. Conservation organisations and authorities also need to rethink the approach to regulating traditional medicine markets. Blanket bans and prohibition have not evidenced declines, rather the opposite, where increased scarcity has driven black market prices even higher. Finally, Educational campaigns must highlight the essential ecosystem services vultures provide and reframe these species as something that is fundamental to life rather than associated with death. Thanks for listening.
Amazing, thank you so much, Niall. I feel like I kind of have a whole new soft spot now for the vulture. I kind of didn't realise what a valuable member they were. Amazing, thank you so much. Okay, up next we have Hyrule. Hyrule is a PhD student in South Africa, working to understand the behaviour of venomous snakes and how this relates to snake bites. She's also the African Programme Manager at Save the Snakes, an NPO dedicated to snake conservation and human-snake conflict mitigation. Hyrule's goal is to share her love of snakes with others and reduce the fear of snakes. Over to you.
Thank you, Beth. So snakes, one of the most unloved animals, but here goes. So puff adders are venomous snakes that are found throughout much of Africa. And they're known as Africa's most dangerous snakes because they are responsible for so many bites. And it is this reputation that has induced fear in people around the world. But puff adders need love, just like any other snake. There are many reasons why they deserve our love. For one, they are incredibly beautiful animals. And beauty is something that we as humans greatly admire, especially in other animals like birds. So why not in snakes? Next slide, please. Puff adders have evolved to be exceptional hunters and have some of the most unique adaptations to the environments that they live in. They are extreme ambush foragers, which lie motionless for days, waiting for their prey to pass them by, and then they strike. They rely on this ability to hide in plain sight under things like shrubs and bushes, using their astonishingly good camouflage. In fact, they camouflage so well, they are masters of camouflage. Not only do puff adders have cryptic coloration in various shades of brown, but they have also evolved something incredible. They do not have a scent. This makes them undetectable, even to the most keenly nosed predators like meerkats and mongoose. One of the biggest benefits that puff adders can provide us is bringing balance to our ecosystems. They feed on rats and mice, which are often considered pests, especially to farmers. They can often spread diseases through crops, and this is primarily their goal, to eat them. A common misconception is that puff adders often strike backwards. This is completely incorrect, as puff adders only have fangs on their upper jaw, so it is impossible for them to strike backwards. People often get bitten by puff adders when attempting to kill the snake, and in fact, this is often how many snake bites occur. So as a snake expert, we recommend that it's best to leave the snake alone, and often what you'll find is that the snake will completely move away. Snakes are really quite majestic animals, and they should be admired and respected from afar, of course. Thank you.
Amazing, thank you so much, Hyrule. I've always had a bit of a soft spot for snakes myself, so I was so glad that there was a snake who was getting an unloved animal spot today. Amazing, thank you very much. Up next, we have Danny. Danny is in his final year of his PhD at Imperial, where he is investigating the combined impacts of climate change and pesticide exposure on bumblebees. Although he loves bumblebees, he wants to raise awareness about the role of other, more undervalued insect pollinators and the importance of halting the dramatic global declines we're all currently witnessing. Over to you, Danny. Danny, I think you've forgotten to unmute. Sorry.
Sorry. There's always one in there. Cool, right, I'll start again. So my species is the red mason bee, but I want this to be a champion for all our solitary bees, really. So I'm not really going to play the unloved card because everyone loves bees and pretty much every tea towel or cushion you see has a bee image sewn onto it. So I do feel like a bit of an imposter here. But if you think about it, nearly all these images are of honeybees or bumblebees. So what I want to do is persuade you just how undervalued and underappreciated red mason bees are. So solitary bees are different from our more well-known social bees like honeybees and bumblebees, because each female lays her own eggs and they usually have individual nests rather than living in a colony. So the red mason bee is a solitary bee that is quite common here in the UK, and you should hopefully see it flying around at the moment. It gets the first part of its name from its lovely red and orange fur on its body, and the second part from the cool way it builds its nest using mud. They build their nests in pre-existing holes, commonly in gaps in brickwork and timber, but they've also been known to nest in hollow plant stems, keyholes in doors, and even in old snail shells like you can see here. So the females crawl into these holes and they lay their eggs in cells which they fill with pollen and then cap with mud as they move along the tube. So the next slide should show that quite well. The face has a pair of long curved horns, and they use this to manipulate the mud into the positions that you see there. So now what's important to point out is that in the UK, there's just one species of honeybee, about 25 species of bumblebee, but around 250 species of solitary bee. But the news very rarely mentions these 250 species. So the next slide, the simple infographic shows 10 of the biggest group of bees in Europe. So the top panel shows the number of species of bee in each genera, and the bottom panel shows the number of academic studies carried out on each of these groups. So you don't need to know all the names or see them there, but the striking thing I want to highlight here is the first two blue bars on the left. So they represent honeybees and bumblebees. So there's one species of honeybee in Europe, but there are over 15,000 recorded publications on it. Compare this to around 100 species of osmia, which are the mason bees, for which there are only 300 publications. So there's 100 times as many species here, but 50 times less work done. So basically, solitary bees are massively understudied, but they're hugely important for our wildlife and for our food. So you may have heard the phrase that 1 in 3 mouthfuls of food come from bees. Red mason bees play a massive role in this, and they're vital for the pollination of certain food plants. And they're actually way more efficient than honeybees in pollinating most plants. So the red mason bee is one of the first to emerge in the year, and so it can pollinate all those early spring plants such as strawberry that other bees can't. This is why having such a diversity of bee species is important, so that pollination occurs all through the season. It's also a very hardy pollinator, and it will forage in wet and windy conditions when most honeybees would stay in the hive and sit out. And probably most importantly, they're really furry, which is incredibly useful for catching and spreading pollen from flower to flower. So the red mason bee doesn't have pollen baskets on its hind legs, which is where honeybees ball up and store pollen when they're foraging, as you can see on the next picture. So this means they get more pollen stuck to their fur, particularly in a big clump of hairs under their abdomen called the scopa. Now this pollen really easily rubs off onto the female parts of plants when they visit other flowers, and that makes them amazing pollinators. In particular, red mason bees are extremely efficient at pollinating fruit trees. So the best guess is that it takes an entire colony of honeybees, which is usually around 20,000 bees, to pollinate an acre of apple orchard. But just 200 red mason bees can do the same job. So red mason bees are massively underappreciated pollinators. Now, some of you may have seen that Marks and Spencer's recently announced it's set up 1,000 honeybee hives on farms around the UK. Now, whilst this sounds great, it has been met with a lot of backlash from scientists and conservationists, because these honeybees will outcompete our native solitary bees and use up all their resources. So we really need to raise awareness of just how important bee diversity is, as different bees pollinate different plants and at different parts of the year. So despite the importance of solitary bees, their numbers are declining heavily across the globe, including in Europe and here in the UK. So whilst the number of managed honeybee hives in Europe has generally increased over the last 50 years, it is believed the population numbers of red mason bees have followed the opposite trend. And that could be due to loads of reasons, such as loss of habitat from farming and urbanisation, applying lots of chemical pesticides to crops and even in gardens, and also the spread of disease from managed honeybees and bumblebees into our solitary bees. An important thing to highlight as well is that the red mason bee is nearly always found to be more sensitive to pesticides compared to honeybees and bumblebees. So just to end, clearly we don't value or love the red mason bee enough, or else we wouldn't be seeing the alarming declines in numbers that we are. when they're so important for our food security and our wildflowers and the natural world around us. So thank you, that's me.
Thank you very much, Danny. I didn't know the solitary bees are so important. I feel like there's some massive rebranding we need to do to get everyone talking about more solitary bees. Amazing, thank you so much. So yeah, thank you to Holly, John, Niall, Hyrule and Danny for those really interesting flash presentations. I'm now going to open up the floor to questions, so if I can bring everybody magically back in and open up the floor to questions. We've got our first question here. From Peter, do toads provide any important ecosystem functions?
So it's well known that it's well known one of the key roles that amphibians generally play in communities and ecosystems is by consuming lots of invertebrates. So it's the kind of thing that in our garden kids you wanted frogs and toads because they ate slugs, they ate snails, they ate all the sort of creepy crawlers that gardeners typically want in gardens to grow vegetables and so on. On a larger scale, there's some nice evidence from Central America. So Central America was one of the first places to suffer amphibian declines as a result of amphibian disease. So the chytridiomycosis, it's called. Central America suffered some massive declines in the late 90s, early 2000s. And two things that happened is there are subsequent increases in the cases of malaria. We think it's because the number of amphibians was so high and it crashed so suddenly that mosquitoes suddenly started doing really well. In that part of the world, amphibians play, and again, amphibians really, is as prey items to things like snakes. As somebody who also loves snakes, I have keen interest in this, and it's because of the decline in amphibians, there's less food, and the abundance of snakes and the number of snake species, the diversity is quite considerably in as well. So these unforeseen things that before amphibians declined we might not have seen happening in both directions in the food chain, if you like, have been quite considerable, and it affects us as well in the case area, of course. So that's a broader answer than common toads on. That's what I've got.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Okay, question here for Holly. How do ants protect the trees from infection and disease?
So this is really interesting. It's just coming into the field now. So when I did my field work a couple of years ago, I hadn't heard anything about it at the time. So it's like really kind of cutting edge. But from what I can tell, the current line of inquiry on this is that the ants themselves have a strain of bacteria on their legs, a strain of bacteria that isn't harmful to the plant. And as they walk about eating, protecting the plant, they drop all of those bacteria that aren't harmful, and that inhibits the growth of bacteria that are harmful to the plant. So that means that the leaves aren't damaged in the way that they would be if a different species of ant or no ants at all were found on the plant.
Really interesting. Thank you, Holly. We've got another one for John here. What do you think makes toads so undervalued and unloved to society? And what do you think the best ways are to combat these potential misconceptions?
In a way, it's difficult to answer that because as you've probably gathered, it's I've felt and never thought about with drawing frogs and plates from a kid. I guess with the toad, I mean, it's always been used as an insult, hasn't it? You know, you call somebody a lying toad, a creepy toad. There's not that I'm a big fan of Shakespeare or anything, but as an insult place. So I don't know why that is. Is it because they live in dark, damp, moist areas? Is it because of the way they look? So there's sort of folklore about if you handle a toad, all of which is false, of course. I don't honestly know because I obviously am biased. I love them. If you wanted to turn that around, if you wanted to get people on board, if you wanted to there's another picture that if you look at the Natural History Photographer of the Year, Common Toad, there's a lovely picture of it's a night photograph, really dark, and you just see this beautiful copper eye of the toad, and it's wonderful. And if you look into a toad's eye, I sound all romantic now. It's fantastic. It's beautiful. So as well as the ecosystem function, the pharmaceuticals we can get from the skin and things like this, and what they might do in our gardens for garden pests and so on. I think if people are actually aware of how they live their lives, the life cycle, but also just take the actually look at them, I think there's a lot there. The harmless creatures, as I said, the temperament, when you're doing field work with them, is fantastic. It is. You don't have to try. You just scoop them up. They're sitting there, just perfect animals to look at, and then you release them, and it's absolutely lovely. So they're really placid. They're really calm. They look grumpy. To some people, they might look a bit ugly. Not me, but beauty's in the eye of the beholder. But for what they are and how they're fascinating. The other thing, if I'm talking to my students, sexual selection, about territoriality, about animal communication, about any of this stuff, you could get it from common toads. I could talk on them about different aspects of the curriculum. So, whatever you're interested in, we can get toads in there somewhere.
Beauty is the eye of the toad. There we go. Amazing. Thanks, John. Hero, I've got a question for you. Is chemical crypsis something unique to the puff adder?
So no, chemical crypsis, or the ability to not have a scent, is not unique to the puff adder. It's probably common in other ambush snakes, like the Australian death adder, but this hasn't been tested in a lot of other snakes. So there's so many different aspects about snakes that we are yet to understand. This is yet another very interesting characteristic about them.
Amazing, thank you. Question for Niall. When a vulture dies from poisoning and other scavengers or hungry carnivores feed on the carcass, is the poison transferred through the food web, and how does this affect more beloved big cats?
That's an interesting question. So first of all, it generally depends on what the poison or the chemical is. I mean, some things like diclofenac as a veterinary drug can be specific to vultures, but generally poison, as it goes through different carcasses, will become more dilute and more lethal depending what the animal is. I think the big worry for vultures is that if you have other scavengers like a hyena or jackals that tend not to be quite the same amount at a carcass. So with vultures, as you saw in one of the examples, it'd be 400 or 500 individuals at a carcass, whereas you wouldn't get anything near that much of other species. So you can really have these single huge events that have just incredibly dire consequences. In terms of how this affects our beloved big cats, I just think that's an interesting question in general, because I mean, this is kind of exactly what I study, like what makes people like big cats so much more than vultures or toads or snakes or any of these other animals. And I think it probably has a relatively negligible effect on big cats. There's other more important threats.
Brilliant, thank you. And there's a slight follow-up there as well. For Niall, is there any or many conservation organisations that take care of vultures?
Yeah, there are. I mean, BirdLife International do a fantastic job in terms of research. Vulpro in South Africa do a great job. But again, I think because they're maybe not necessarily seen as particularly charismatic, a lot of conservation organizations will do the research, but they'll try and use other flagship species to kind of get their funding. So it's not very often that you will see articles about vultures or even studies about vultures.
Yeah, well, hopefully our chat tonight will help raise awareness for all the different animals. Brilliant, thank you. Danny, question for you. Do mason bees produce honey? And then also, why do you think that honeybees and bumblebees get so much attention in comparison?
Yeah, so no, mason bees don't produce honey. So their life cycle is quite different. So social bees will produce, so honeybees obviously produce honey, and bumblebees make something quite similar, but that's usually used as like a food source for the colony. So foragers will go out and bring it back to a colony. They'll store it in little honey pots, and that's what the rest of the workers in the colony can feed off. Mason bees and other solitary bees have a bit of a different life cycle. So a female will go out, mate, come back, and she'll build those little nests, and she just leaves a store of sometimes, well, mainly pollen, but also bits of nectar for her larvae to develop on. So there's no real need for them to produce honey as part of their life cycle, really. So the other part, why do you think honeybees and bumblebees get so much attention? I think probably because there's a lot of them, and also because they're like incredibly important for crop pollination and stuff like that. So being managed, honeybees have obviously been incredibly important for our food security and food production throughout, you know, the last 50 or 100 years. So I think it maybe stems from there. I think a lot of the research, a lot of the work is done on honeybees because of their perceived importance. I think there's been a bit of a push in the literature recently to appreciate how important diversity is, because, like I say, a lot of solitary bees are specialised to certain plants that honeybees won't touch, and they come out at different times of the year. So having that sort of diverse bee community is really important. Yeah, so I think there needs to be more of a sort of an appreciation of that, really.
Definitely. Thanks very much, Danny. A question for Holly. How do the ants protect the trees from infectious disease? Followed up with how did ant eusociality evolve?
So there are two. So this is an example of convergent evolution. So there are two separate clades which both perform the same function. One is performed in South America. The other one can be seen in Africa. One of these examples evolved in the late Miocene, and then the later one happened about 3 million years later. It started off with a type of ant which was not aggressive, so it didn't provide the same levels of protection that the current acacia ants do, and they would inhabit dead twigs on the forest floor, and then over time, however it happened, I'm not entirely sure, but they went from just being a sneaky opportunist taking what they could to actually providing benefits. So in a way, they started off the same as the con artist ants I mentioned, that take everything and don't give anything in return. So maybe one day that other species of ant that currently doesn't offer any benefit will offer benefit itself someday.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Another question for Danny. What's something we can do for bees at home, but specifically if you don't have a garden?
If you don't have a garden, if you've got a balcony, you can put plants out on there. Yeah, I guess the normal things are things like bee hotels, for solitary bees. So providing that sort of tube for them to be able to go in and make their nest in. And red mason bees particularly.
Sorry, that was actually a follow-up question. So are insect and bee houses a good idea? Yeah,
I think they are. But I think there's certain types you can get. So I think you need to be careful about which ones you buy. I think they need to be capped at one end so that a bee will go in and then be able to build their nest out rather than being open-ended. So there's some good links on like the Wildlife Trust sites on how to build one yourselves, or the right ones to buy. Red mason bees, I think, so they come out really early in the year, so they're usually the first species you'll see on the wing, and they do take quite readily to bee hotels, I think. So that would definitely be a good thing to do. And to plant flowers that are so not ornamentals, basically, so anything that's got a single flower, so that the bees are able to get into the nectar and the pollen stores in the plant. So bees see purple quite well, so anything like purple plants are usually quite good, like lavender and camin and stuff, and buddleia. If you don't have a garden, I guess the main thing to do is to get involved with an organisation, things like the Wildlife Trust, Bumblebee Conservation Trust, things like that, Bug Life. I think there's quite a big push in these organisations to work in cities to build green spaces, increase the number of wildflowers and plants in like roadside verges, things like that, trying to connect habitat in all these spaces. So if you can try to get involved in an organisation or something like that that's doing that work, yeah, that's probably a good idea.
Brilliant, thank you. Got another follow-up question for you as well, Danny. So how else can we increase the bee population without producing competition for pollen? Yeah,
so I think the thing at the moment is a lot of companies having to go into sustainability and this thing about greenwashing. And the thing with Marks and Spencer is sort of described as bee washing. It's like trying to, I don't think it's with their intention or anything, but you know, if you want to like show that you're helping and you're trying to improve these pollinator populations, so everyone thinks honeybees, they're really easy, not easy to keep, they're quite difficult to keep, but you can buy them in, you can buy the colonies, you can buy, farmers can buy commercial bumblebee colonies as well, so you can get those and keep them. Whereas solitary bees, you can't really do that. So introducing a honeybee hive or something like that, where there's you know, thousands, tens of thousands of bees, introduces quite a lot of competition for all the other solitary bees in that area. So I think the main thing to do is to increase habitat. Basically, I think the reason we're seeing declines in solitary bees is because they don't have as much habitat. Our farmland is usually quite intensively farmed. It's sort of blanket monocultures, so there's not that much pollen and nectar available for a lot of the year. We've traditionally sort of cut roadside verges and kept everything quite neat and tidy. So I think the way to help them, rather than introduce more bees, is to improve the habitat and the number of flowers and pollen sources available to them.
Brilliant. And we've actually got a comment from our viewers saying on the topic of competition. Ella says that she has a wall in their barn full of red mason bees. They're also currently trained to keep honeybees. So how far away should they site their honeybees so they don't have an impact on the red mason bees?
I'm probably not qualified to answer that, but it depends. If you've got a barn, you've probably got quite a nice big garden and area. As long as there's a lot of resources for them, I'm sure they'll be fine. It could be quite a nice experiment to see, you know, to look at them on flowers and see which ones are doing well. Yeah, I probably can't answer that question particularly well. If there's enough flowers and stuff in the area, then it should be fine, I guess.
Maybe Ella can get in touch with you, their findings, and let you know what were the hot spots for each type.
Yeah, you might. I guess it depends on the flowers as well. You could sort of see. I think honeybees tend to go for quite like showy big flowers, whereas mason bees go for things like, like particularly like fruit trees. If you've got any fruit trees, apple, pears, cherries and stuff, they'll be quite good on those. So a diversity of flowers and stuff in your garden should help a lot.
Amazing, thank you. We've also got another question, so for each of you. So what other unloved animal would you love to research and why? So start with Niall.
The other animal is probably is a toss-up whether I was going to do that this evening, but it would be the dung beetle. I think, the dung beetles are incredibly industrious, incredibly important species, and it's super diverse and interesting. And so I did a little bit of research on them as well in South Africa, and so I'd love to do more research on that.
Brilliant. Holly?
Unloved, but not necessarily not researched. I think it would be nice to study bats and maybe get some more love for bats, because, you know, they're a protected species, they're everywhere, but lots of people just see them as a nuisance, and it would be quite nice to kind of raise awareness for that and make people appreciate bats more.
Definitely. John?
Probably we tend to have a lot of arachnophobes, so I'd pick a species spider or a group of spiders, probably jumping spiders. So these are these tiny ones that do some amazing communication, and when you see the zoomed in photographs of them, they're absolutely spectacular. So yeah, probably peacock spiders.
I love peacock spiders. I've seen all the gifs of them dancing. I think that's really fun. Hyrule, the question was, what other unloved animal would you wish you could research and why?
So I'm going to stick to the reptilian groups and say lizards or crocodiles. They're so often, rejected, especially crocodiles, but they're really such fascinating animals. And I think a lot more people need to kind of appreciate how really cool they are and how prehistoric they really are and what they represent within the animal kingdom.
Brilliant, thank you. And Danny?
I'd probably quite like to research ants, to be honest. Like Holly, I'm quite really interested in like sociality and stuff, and communication. So I think, yeah, maybe ants, and then maybe did some research once on like freshwater shrimp, and they're probably quite unloved and underappreciated. Like tiny little freshwater shrimp in the UK, they're quite important for like recycling and breaking down leaf litter and nutrient cycling and stuff. So maybe little things like that.
Amazing. Well, I think we've got the panel sorted for Unloved Animals Volume 2. So this sounds great. And just before we finish up our questions, one last question just come in for Hyrule. Do puff adders share their habits with other species of snakes? And do they behave? How do they behave? I think we might have lost Hyrule there. I know she's dedicated to the snake cause. She's in a power cut, so doing her best in the car. So definitely representing the snakes there. Okay, and one last question for Niall. How can we raise awareness on the impact of the belief that vultures can be beneficial for the treatment of medical ailments that harm their populations?
How can we raise awareness? I think a lot of that's down to do with people losing their connection with nature. And Hyrule might be able to provide like a secondary thought on this, because I'm sure she does some stuff with traditional medicine and snakes. But a lot of traditional medicine belief, the reason it's becoming so much of a problem is because so many populations in cities are becoming so big, and where you would have had that feedback mechanism between things not being very common and animal products being used to treat certain ailments, you no longer have that anymore, and it's become a little bit more commercialized and people kind of promoting certain treatments over other treatments. And so because people have lost that connection to nature, they don't understand that necessarily taking this might harm the actual species that they're using. So there's no sustainability about it. The other thing that I briefly touched on was just that for a lot of these species, because it's illegal, there's very, very difficult to study, to communicate with people who don't want to talk about it. And there just needs to be a little bit more like engagement with people and stakeholders who are kind of involved in that trade, and just education and understanding on both sides.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Well, thank you to all our panel for their amazing presentations and answering all the questions. So now, the audience at home, you've got a very important decision to make. Who is your most loved animal from the Unloved Animal Club? You should go to the link, which you should be able to magically see on screen and in the chat. You don't need to register, you just put in the code and you can go vote. You've got 2 minutes to vote. And whilst you're doing that, we're going to hear from poet Robin Lamboll. Dr. Robin Lamboll researches climate change and human emissions. Also a poet, Robin has won the Cambridge, UK and Madrid International Poetry Slam finals and came second in the World Cup of Slam 2019.
Hello, well, thank you. Thank you for all those great talks. Let's take the creatures familiar to us, only as witches' familiars, and ask why are they hated or lacking in love in the company we find outside of a coven? The creeping or scuttling, grimly soaring, warty or buzzing or hissing are scorned in cultures who don't view the pulchritude. In toads, ants, bees, snakes, and vultures too. So let's start our ode with the humblest toad. Kiss them and lick them, and you soon may croak. Their skin is blistered in poisonous nodes, and yet it's so porous. They feel everything. Where it's thinnest, they breathe, and even drink in whatever foul toxins they come across, indicating the waste we humans have tossed, while this toad skin needs to hold firm against masses of mold and the deadly wet germs our bulbous friend bathes in. The mucins and poisons it makes keeps it safe from concern. And what follow-up could be occulter than a vulture? Anthrax-eating soldiers whose sojourns roam over thousands of kilometers. Cooperative, food-finding creatures, so while you think that life on the brink of extinction at least means it's less effort feasting in practice, one carcass can feed many masters, and they find food faster with a vaster ringed array of vultures flying rasters all in search of decay, so a population crash becomes a disaster, as assorted corpses are allowed to fester when excess deaths lack a winged digester. But they're pests to poachers, and killed by cow medicine. When they collide with power lines, they face the wrath of Edison. Hence these long-ranged kill-seeking reapers are endangered by human habitat creep. That's not the case for the mason bees, who makes homes in the holes that we humans leave, which they pile up with pollen for their larvae to gnaw on, and seal up the cell with some mud they infill by munching it well in their small mandibles, then pat into place with the horns on their face. They're opportunists, and so they persist in making their nests without any duress. As humans replaced all our woodlands with waste, swap shell and plant stem for brick wall and hold fence, still they fly, pollinating, hairy thighs and bodies taking more than humble bumblebees, whose neater nectar-seeking leaves fewer and less fertile trees. But they'd like us to provide fewer pesticides, altogether avoid neonicotinoids, and leave room with more blooms for them to enjoy. Puff the magic adder lives by the path and nibbles on the ankles of the humans who go past, about half of whom die in agony. Reminding, why are we supposed to love these? They're more scared of you than you are of them. Unfortunately, their fear response is to spear you with venomous fangs, so thanks, but no, I'll stick to toads. They give birth to live young, just like my mum, but that doesn't outweigh all the toxic torture. We give awards to Mother Teresa, not Lucretia Borgia, much to Darwin's dismay. Anyway, the puff adder's tempting tongue lures mice to their death, so one upside is they kill vermin, slowly, watching until they stop squirming, reducing pests. And what's best is to hide. They give off no scent. If only humans reduced the smog that we vent to invisibility. And finally, we have acacia ants, who show the power of loving plants, of finding the place where you belong so deep. You'll tear off your wings to make home, keep nestled inside the sharpest thorns, and fight huge monsters with your tiny jaws, to save your source of energy and nourishment, everything that roots you, and everything you root for, to become a superorganism with your closer than sisters, and hold fast to a greater existence. Each of these animals has a lesson for us: how to stop emitting, how to become porous, how to live in and cling to what nature provides, how in times of change the smallest can survive, how in times of death we can renew the earth, and all of them to be unloved, and yet to have such worth. Thank you.
Amazing, Robin. Thank you so much for that amazing performance. Okay, it's now time for the results of the public vote. This is the answer you've all been waiting for, bigger than finding out who H actually is. Let's find out who your most loved animal from the Unloved Animal Club is. Dramatic drum roll. The winner is the white-backed vulture. Well done to Niall. Congratulations.
Thanks very much. I've been dreaming of this day for a while now.
Amazing. Well, that's our new most loved creature. Fantastic. Okay, well, unfortunately, time is just about up for tonight's discussion. Thank you so much to all our unloved animal lovers, Robin for that fantastic poem, and the magic production team making everything look seamless behind the scenes. To everyone watching at home, we really hope you have enjoyed this evening, learned something new, and maybe you have a new soft spot for an animal that you didn't think was quite so lovable after all. Thank you for tuning in and providing in some excellent questions of your own. Apologies if we didn't get a chance to get to yours. A recording of this event will soon appear at the Imperial College YouTube channel for you to watch again or to share with your friends or colleagues whenever you like. A link will also be posted in the chat to an evaluation form where you can tell us what you thought of this event. Please take 5 minutes to fill that in and let us know what you thought. As I mentioned at the start, tonight is just the first of 5 fabulous days of Imperial Lates online events, celebrating our planet's incredible wildlife. So please keep tuned for tomorrow's email from the Lates team with details of the next event in the series. Otherwise, that's it from me and the team. Thank you so much. Good night and have a good evening.